Okay, great. Listen, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Oswaldo Mestri. I am the Director of Citizen Services and Executive Director here in the city of Buffalo. Mayor Scanlon is our mayor, and I want to say thank you to him and to the staff and to everyone here within the Division of Citizen Services for allowing us to have our block chat. Many of you know, if you don't, we started our block chat during the pandemic and wanted to make sure we had two-way communication with folks and residents and neighborhood groups. Obviously, the pandemic affected the city and affected the world and this country. But one of the things it did is that we found that people had to be resourceful, and we wanted to share that and wanted to share information. We were so successful. We said, let's, we have something here. The city of good neighbors. Let's make sure there's a lot of information and make sure that we're connecting people. And so, since the pandemic, we've had different speakers from City Hall, from different levels of government. We had topical speakers, to talk about various different things, whether it be food insecurities or neighborhood gardening or all sorts of stuff, disaster preparation. But we also talked about health, wellness, all of these other things. And today our topic is equally as important, but very relevant, not only to one specific group, but I think to us as a whole. And so I'm excited that we're going to have some speakers here from Crisis Services. I'll get to the point where we'll introduce them, but it's such a relevant topic. And we want to make sure that we wanted to provide audience to this. In country or sometimes in things we do, we celebrate, a day or a month. And so last month was Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And I think it was important to bring audience to this. And so we're going to have some speakers that's going to speak to that and much more. So I'm excited about that. Before we do that, I'm going to introduce some. Many know Nicole. Nicole here works within the Division of Citizen Services. She's going to go through announcements, and then we're going to have our speakers.
Thank you. So I'm going to quickly share my screen with you. Guys, let me know when you can see the screen. Okay. So it's going faster than I want. Okay, so as always, just want to remind everybody we are looking for people to join our team. This is the project of AmeriCorps. So if you want to make a difference or know somebody who might be perfect for this program, please contact Ms. Malika D. Lee. She is our External Affairs Manager for this information. Want to talk a little bit about the Clean Sweeps season 2024. So I don't know if Michael Smith, he is our Clean Sweeps coordinator, if you want to just say a few words about your Clean Sweep season and talk a little bit about the finale of the Clean Sweep. Michael, if you're talking, we cannot hear you. No, I could just talk a little bit about the finale if you'd like me to.
No, go ahead. I think Mike was saying that the slides were not coming in, but why don't you just give everybody an update on what the items are.
Awesome, great. So the Queen Sleep season 2024 has been amazing. We've had a number of new innovations. One of the biggest has been the medical model innovation that really touches on bringing the medical interventions into the communities that have been identified as high need communities. So that's been one of the best innovations of this season. We are having the finale Clean Sweep next week. It will be in the Madison District. We'll be joined by Mayor Scanlon and a number of our partners to celebrate the great work of the Clean Sweep season 2024. So look out more for that information and for information about the entirety of the season and how everything has gone thus far with Clean Sweeps. So we do also want to share a little bit about waste drop-off. So this has been a pretty big thing. Actually, we just want to remind people there are 3 different drop-offs for waste. So electronic waste, refuse disposal, and yard waste. So there are different locations and they have different times. This will be reposted again for everybody so you can kind of adhere to the different places. E-District is having a donation drive, Share the Warmth event. This is going on through November 10th at Bailey Avenue. So they're collecting various winter items. And for more information, contact the E-District Police Station. And Buffalo Common Council is also hosting a winter preparedness series. So this is still going on through Friday, November 15th. You please register online at buffalony.gov /council winter prep so that you can receive one of their winter kits as well. If you are looking to start a block club, please reach out to the Board of Block Clubs of Buffalo and Erie County. They have an email, phone number, Facebook, and Instagram. They are very responsive on all platforms. And if you just would like assistance with your block club, please reach out to them as well. They still have classes for seniors at the Dorothy J. Collier Community Center. The last one is going to be November 13th. This is touching on files and folders. You can register for this as well by calling the number on screen. And the Strengthening Families program, which is hosted by the Prevention Council. It is 100% free and strengthens parent and youth communication skills, as well as touches on academic success, substance abuse, and other behaviors that teens may get involved in. It includes potluck and family fun activities. This also requires pre-registration, and you can contact Karen Owens at the number on screen or go to the Prevention Council website online as well. The Complete Streets Workshop is being hosted Monday, November 11th at Sisters Hospital from 6 to 8. So this is part of the Clean Mobility Buffalo initiative. You can join Go Bike Buffalo and your neighbors to talk a little bit about making streets safer for everyone on them, and you join your neighbors for a presentation about all of these things and walk the Trinidad neighborhood together. So this is hosted by the president of the Trinidad Neighborhood Association, Ms. Ellen Harris Harvey. And just a few announcements from the library. So Crane Branch Library wanted to share a little bit about preschool story time, Fridays at 10. So if you know somebody who might benefit from this, please share the information with them. And there are interactive stories, and it is intended for 3 to 5-year-olds, but others are welcome to join. They also have Tuesday story time at 10:30 a.m. This started September 3rd, but has continued on. And then they have a Lego club ages 6 to 12 every Thursday from 5 to 6 p.m. And we do want to just share to make sure everybody is informed to please download Buff Alert. So this is our easy to use emergency alert system. It will send out notifications in emergency situations. And you can also sign up for a multilingual Buff Alert as well at buffalony.gov /Buff-Alert, or you can text your zip code to 38276 and it will sign you up right away on the spot. And please follow us on social media. So you can follow us at the Division of Citizen Services on Facebook at Buffalo Citizen Services, and on Instagram at Buffalo 311, and at our 311 call and response center page on Facebook as well. And if you do not follow Mayor Chris Scanlon, please follow him on his Facebook page at Mayor Christopher Scanlon. And Oz, I am going to turn it back over to you.
Nicole, thank you for your announcements here. As always, we've asked groups, if you're having any kind of announcements to share and spread out, let us know so that we can push that out, and let everyone know as we work very closely with the Board of Block Clubs of Buffalo and Erie County. Let me take this opportunity to introduce our speakers, but to give audience to a very important topic. And many would think that this only just affects a few, but this is not this relevant. But whether we have individuals that we know, whether it be family members, but just as a community, we should be uplifted and understand what are the situations, and not only if you're in that situation, if you know somebody, but just at the community. What affects those who have been affected by this affects us all, right? And the more we know about something, the more we know about this particular topic, I think when identified, we can best handle that too. And I'm just giving this a brief, and I'm talking about this very serious because I don't think, enough of us understand how this affects individuals, but how this affects the whole community. And so I'm happy to have two individuals here from Crisis Services. Crisis Services does a lot of great things within this community. It denotes in the name that when there are challenges that you have, maybe individually or collectively in life, there's an organization, there's a number that you can call and we can follow up. And so we have two individuals here, Samantha Steiner and Kayla Sharif here, who's going to be talking about an understanding of domestic and sexual violence awareness. And so I'm going to turn this over to you. We'll do a little Q&A after, and then we'll have the Board of Block Clubs follow up, kind of giving us our close. So thank you, ladies.
Thank you so much, Oswaldo. I really appreciate that introduction. My colleague Kayla is joining us today. She's going to be sharing her screen with us, so that way we can check out some of our slides. So if you want to do that, Kayla, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And I hope that everyone is having a good November 1st, that maybe you got to eat some candy last night, watch a scary movie here or there.
Yeah.
Yep, and we're starting off for a new month, so that's always exciting. And I really appreciate you having us on at this time as well, because we just wrapped up October, which was Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So the timing for this conversation, I think, is really important. And we hope to continue having these conversations throughout the entire year, right? Not just limiting these ideas and these conversations to 1 month, but really having this being an ongoing discussion. So it's appreciated.
No problem.
Awesome. Okay. So as Oswaldo already mentioned, we are here with Crisis Services, and we're going to be providing you all with an overview of domestic and sexual violence. And so if you're not familiar with Crisis Services, we are a 24-hour crisis center. We service all of Erie County, and we provide support for survivors of sexual and domestic violence within our advocate department, which is where Kayla and I are from. We like to give you all just a little bit of a background on who we are, since we are discussing some, heavy and emotional topics today. We figure it helps for you all to know a little bit about who we are behind just our professional roles. But speaking on that, I am a prevention education specialist with Crisis Services, so my role is really focused on going out into the community, doing community outreach and education to help to prevent these forms of violence from happening in the first place. I'm actually from Florida originally. I went to the University of Florida, go Gators, where I studied public health and political science. So this work really encompasses so many of my passions, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today talking about this. So like we mentioned briefly, the topics that we're going to be discussing today are an overview of what these forms of violence are, how we can recognize them in our lives and the lives of those around us. We're going to talk a little bit about how we can support survivors in our everyday lives, and we'll be discussing resources that are available, as well as the work that the Advocate Department at Crisis Services does. We have some notes here about self-care because we're going to be discussing topics such as domestic and sexual violence in detail. These can be really difficult conversations. And so if you need to take a break, turn off your camera, go to the bathroom, get a drink of water, whatever that may be, please feel free to do so. We want you all to take care of yourselves and to get whatever is beneficial for you out of this conversation. And with that, I also really highly encourage questions and comments. I'll be asking y'all to drop some answers to questions I have in the chat throughout the presentation. You can feel free to also use the raise hand function and speak verbally if you'd like. But if not, if you prefer just to kind of chat, you're welcome to do that. And with that, because these are sensitive topics, we also just ask that everyone be respectful of one another, because we really don't know what everyone's experiences have been, right? We all have been through different experiences, and it's really important just to be respectful of that. And last, I will be sharing some resources with everyone, as well as my contact information. So if you have further questions, you can feel free to follow up afterwards. We have another note here, just that we might use different words throughout the presentation. We might use terms like client, victim, or survivor, and those are all interchangeable, and they're referring to the same person, which is the individual who's experienced the harm in a situation. And we might use words like perpetrator or abuser or assailant, and those are all referring to the person who's committed the act of harm in that situation. Okay, so I figured that I would start us off with a little activity to kind of get our minds thinking about the topics for today and just to kind of see where we're at in our knowledge right now. Try to do a poll with having a little bit of technical difficulty, so I'm just going to ask y'all to drop your responses in the chat if that works for everyone. So I'm going to have a statement and you all can just share in the chat if you think it's a myth about domestic violence or if you think it's a fact. So we can go to the first question. Domestic violence victims are always women and abusers are always men. Do we think that is a myth or a fact? Drop it in the chat. All right, I see lots already coming in. We have most people are saying myth or false. We have one person thinking that maybe it's a fact. We have some different opinions here. And I think this is a really important question because we hear a lot of narratives within our society, right? That men are the violent ones, that they're the ones who are capable of committing harm, and that the role of a woman in a relationship is to be submissive or to be protected. And so we might imagine that they're not capable of committing acts of harm or abuse themselves. And we do know that statistically, women are more frequently the victims of domestic violence because of different beliefs within our society, because of discrimination that they experience. However, we do know that anyone of any gender can be a perpetrator or a victim of domestic violence. And similarly, we often see these dynamics also within same-sex couples as well. So really, what we want everyone to take home is that anyone can be a victim or a perpetrator of domestic violence. All right, we can go ahead to the next one. A relationship is only considered abusive if there is physical violence involved. Do we think that that is a myth or a fact? I'm saying myth and false. Correct. Seems like everyone here is on the same page and you all are correct. That is a myth. In a second, we're going to be talking about all the different types of abuse that fall within the umbrella term of domestic violence, but you all are doing a great job. Okay, and we'll go to our last question now. Ending an abusive relationship is often the most dangerous time for a survivor of domestic violence. Do we think that is a myth or a fact? All right, looks like most of us are on the same page here as well. It is a fact, and this can be surprising, right? Because we think, why don't people just leave a relationship if it's that bad? Why don't they just go somewhere safer or break up with that person? But we actually know that ending an abusive relationship can be the most dangerous time for a survivor of domestic violence. Up to 1 year after that point is when they're actually the highest risk of homicide by that partner. So we're going to talk more about the dynamics and kind of why that is. You all did a fantastic job, and I'm glad that we're on the same page about a lot of these myths about domestic violence. All right, so getting into things now. Domestic violence is defined as a pattern of abuse in a relationship where one person has power and control over another. And when we're saying the word relationship here, we're talking about any kind of intimate relationship. So it could be a boyfriend and a girlfriend, two people who are dating in some way. Maybe they're exes, they broke up. Maybe they're married or engaged. It does not matter. There does not have to be any kind of title to this relationship. It's any intimate relationship of any kind. And so sometimes people can lump, family violence, maybe among siblings or parent and child within this umbrella. For our sake here today, we are only talking about intimate relationships because they do have a very specific dynamic to them. And you might also have heard terms like intimate partner violence or domestic abuse or relationship or dating violence. Again, for our sake, these are all going to be interchangeable today. They're also referring to the same dynamic of an abusive relationship where there's power and control over one person. And so those are the key words that we really want to have in mind whenever we're thinking about domestic violence, that power and control over another person. And we have here just a few of the different tactics that can be used by one person, the abuser, to exert that power and control over their partner. So if anyone is willing to share in the chat, or you can go ahead, raise your hand, come off mute. Can anyone share what are some examples of what physical abuse might look like in an abusive relationship? What are some ways that that can present? I see. A lot of people are sharing. Awesome, perfect. Right, punching and shoving their partner, pushing or shoving, any kind of fighting, physically hitting, pushing the other person, choking. I see Tiana shared choking, and that is a really important one to keep in mind, because we know that if someone has been choked or strangled, and especially if they've actually passed out from that, that puts them at significantly higher risk of being killed by that abusive partner. But I also see things here like biting as well. You're suggesting some really important things to be aware of, right? And you're covering a lot of the different points that we have. It's really any kind of physical harm that's done to a person without their consent, right? And it can also even show up in ways that we might not expect. If we're thinking about maybe a partner who's withholding medical care from their partner, maybe the survivor in that situation is dependent on a wheelchair to get around. And that abuser is aware of that and uses that to their advantage, and maybe restricts their access to whatever their mobility device might be. That is an incredibly effective way at maintaining power and control over someone physically. I have also, part of our roles at Crisis Services is also providing victim advocacy and crisis intervention in the emergency departments throughout Erie County. And so I even had a client one time who, after surgery, could not care for herself, and her partner was essentially just ignoring her, right? Letting her kind of suffer after this incredibly painful surgery and not helping to care for her with food and things like that. And so that for me was an incredibly jarring scenario to hear. It's not one that we cover often, but it really can show up in any way, right? We can't cover every single example of what this can look like today here within this hour, but it's just important to keep in mind it's any way that someone's exerting power and control over another person. How about emotional abuse? What comes to everyone's minds, if you can share it in the chat, whenever you think about emotional abuse? What are some tactics or behaviors that you might see? Right, so I see name calling, right, belittling someone, making them feel really badly about themselves. And we probably know, right, if we're in an intimate relationship with someone, they probably know us pretty well. And they might know what hurts us or what we're really sensitive about. And so often it could be that name calling or that verbal abuse, making them feel bad in ways that they know will really get to that person. I see bullying, right? Screaming verbally, right? And that can make someone really feel afraid. Linda also shared, if you're with a narcissist, everything is your fault, right? So often within emotional abuse, this is anything that's just really making that person question their own sense of self-worth, right? They feel like they can't do anything right. They might feel like they're walking on eggshells constantly around their partner because they don't know what is going to set them off or make them, explode, right? And this could also be overlapping with different forms of abuse. We could see emotional abuse and then maybe that leading into physical abuse. And one example, I mentioned that Halloween was yesterday. I was watching Paranormal Activity. And what really stood out to me, more so than the paranormal activity itself, was the dynamic between the two individuals in a couple who were the stars of the movie. And so for those who maybe aren't familiar with the movie, right, one woman, Katie, has kind of intermittently been experiencing like some kind of paranormal activity, right, some kind of haunting throughout her life. And it starts up whenever she's living with her boyfriend, Mika. Weird things are happening that they can't explain, and he wants to start recording this, right, to prove, to have capture evidence of what's happening. And throughout the movie, right, he's capturing this evidence of doors moving in unexplainable ways and other weird things that it's very obvious there's something going on here. But he's constantly making her question herself. He's constantly saying, oh, it's not that big of a deal, right? He's kind of trying to like escalate with the demon. He's saying things like, you know, give me what you got, right? We're not afraid of you. Like, is that all you got? Whenever she's like, no, please don't do that. He's ignoring her wishes and her boundaries. She's saying, please stop recording. Please stop using the camera. We're making it angry. I don't want to be videotaped anymore. And instead, he's continuing to record her, just completely ignoring any boundaries that she has tried to set. She begs him not to bring in an Ouija board, if you all are familiar with that. And he does it anyways. And whenever she gets upset about this, he says, oh, you know, this is all your fault. You're the one who brought the demon into the house anyways, right? So just continuously ignoring her boundaries, disrespecting it, not caring how she feels in that situation, and doing what he thinks is right. And so I think that's a really important example, because we often do imagine in these situations someone constantly screaming and angry and just feeling really afraid of that person, which can definitely be the case. But sometimes it shows up in ways that are more subtle, right? And in this movie, Katie still feels like she doesn't have any control over her own well-being because her boyfriend is taking control over how they're handling the situation. So that was my own personal example. While I was watching that movie yesterday, I was like, wow, I don't remember this, but now I'm seeing it and I can't unsee it. Okay, so we're gonna shift now and talk a little bit about sexual abuse. We'll discuss that more in a bit whenever we talk about sexual assault as a whole. But I just want to really note that this can occur within the context of any relationship, right? Regardless of the length of time that maybe someone has been with their partner, whether it's in a marriage, a long distance relationship, a first date, whatever it is, we still need to be establishing consent before any kind of sexual activity with our partners, right? We still want to be respecting their boundaries. And right, that just goes because sometimes there's some misconceptions that we might have about relationships, and you know, we don't have to talk about that kind of stuff, right? It's fine. They're my wife, they're my husband, but we know that we need to be establishing consent regardless of the extent of that relationship. The next one that we have here is financial abuse. Can anyone share in the chat what comes to mind whenever you think about financial abuse? And thank you, Linda, that is very kind. And if you're trying to think of some examples about financial abuse, we're thinking about using someone's finances as a way to exert power and control over them. So I see your Ron shared withholding money for basic needs with intent to make the other suffer. Exactly. Only giving a certain amount of money at a time, which can be like providing your partner with like an allowance, withholding resources from you like rent, right? Maybe refusing to pay rent whenever that's been the established agreement between the two folks, and then refusing to hold up their end, maybe not out of just like financial struggle, but simply to make the other person suffer and be stressed. Impersonating someone and using their funds, absolutely. Withholding financial information, not having your spouse's name on the home deed. These are all really great examples that you all are sharing. Taking money from their bank account. And what's important is that, again, this can show up in ways that might seem more subtle than we expect, right? It can start with just saying, you know, you're not that good at handling financial stuff, right? I like to do that. I'll take care of everything. You don't have to worry about it, which can seem harmless enough to a lot of us. But if that continues to escalate in the ways that you all shared here, right? Withholding that money for basic needs, providing an allowance, not allowing that partner to have access to their own funds, that can absolutely become financial abuse. And then lastly, here we have spiritual abuse, and this involves one person using any kind of spirituality or religious beliefs or cultural beliefs as a way to exert that power and control over another person. So that can look like saying, you know, you can't end this relationship, you can't divorce me, you can't break up with me or leave me. You know, it's your duty, based on what our religious texts say, that you need to stay with me no matter how I treat you. And we know that different people are going to have different beliefs, and that's okay. but we don't want to expect others to tolerate abuse because of those beliefs, right? We know that abuse is never okay. And so that can also look like maybe forcing someone to practice a religion that they don't wish to, or restricting them from practicing their religion of choice, restricting them from wearing their religious garments, or forcing them to wear religious garments that they don't want to. Or maybe even trying to isolate them from their support network through their religious community. Okay, awesome. So that kind of, I know that was a lot, but that just kind of starts to encompass what can be considered as abusive within a relationship. Right, I see Oswaldo shared I can have many wives or spouses. Perfect. And everything is their fault. Yes, that's absolutely an ongoing theme that we will see within abusive relationships. And so here we have the power and control wheel. And so this was actually created in Duluth, Minnesota by some folks that were working directly with survivors. And just trying to understand more about the dynamics of their relationship, of their abusive relationships, and really how that showed up for them. So we see power and control here is at the center because it's at the center of abusive relationships. That's what it's really all about. And we see different tactics here and within those dark blue inner triangles. Things like isolation. Can anyone share what does isolation mean, or what might that look like in an abusive relationship? What impact could that have on the survivor? Linda, I see your question. We will share contact information for crisis services. We'll talk about what resources are available and all of that near the end of this presentation. But does anyone have any ideas about what isolation could mean? Yes, right, I see here. Convincing someone to cut off friends and family, taking away their other resources. Absolutely, right? And it can stem from things like jealousy, potentially, right? Like, I don't trust you going out with these people. I think you're up to no good. You might be cheating on me. So you just I don't want you hanging out with them. I don't want you going out with them, right? You need to stay here with me. Or just like, I don't really like your friends, right? I think that they're kind of bad influences. And I think it's better for you to not hang out with them. Or saying, you spend so much time with your family all the time. Like, I'm your partner. You should be focused on me. Like, you don't need to be spending all this time with them. And over time, that can have the effect, like you all mentioned in the chat here, of being cut off from their other social supports that are really important just in general for all of us in life, but also, especially if we're thinking about someone trying to get out of that abusive relationship, it's going to be a lot harder if they don't have those social supports to lean on. Yes, and controlling, right? As Ms. Allen here shared, and still any attempt to really control that person's whereabouts, where they go, it can involve things like stalking as well. Tracking someone using like location sharing on your phone. That's a really common one that we're starting to see more and more, because often a lot of us have our locations shared with folks. But maybe a refusal to share that is seen as like, well, what are you trying to hide, right? What's your problem? Why can't you just share this with me? But then it can be used as a way to essentially stalk that person, constantly monitor or control their whereabouts, or show up at places uninvited as a means to intimidate that person. Let's see what else here. How about children? Can everyone share, how do you think children could be used as a tactic to maintain power and control over someone? Yeah, you can't leave me or I'll take the kids. Could even be threatening violence against the children themselves. Threatening violence or committing violence against pets is something that we see a lot, because also pets are like our little fur babies a lot of the time. And so that can be really, really difficult for folks and really effective at keeping them in that situation. It can be falsely making CPS reports, right? Trying to like demonize that partner and make them appear bad, or just try to make them fear for their own safety and the safety of their children. It can also look like fighting or trying to maintain control of like child support, refusing to pay child support. Yeah, and it can show up in all different ways. Maybe even if there's like shared custody, telling the children bad things about the other partner, maybe that aren't even true, to try to turn the children against that survivor as well. So again, there's so many ways that this all can show up. And the last one I want to highlight is coercion and threats. And this is really important also because crisis services, besides just our advocate department, we also have our other departments that support those who are experiencing a mental health crisis or suicidal thoughts. And one really complicated threat that we see pretty often as well is the abuser threatening to commit suicide as a tactic to keep that person in that relationship. And that can be extremely effective because that person's really concerned for their partner's well-being, right? They're in that relationship because they do love and care for them. And so that can be extremely effective at keeping someone in that situation. And the last thing I want to get to here, so those are all on those dark blue inner wheels, are the things that happen that we might be more difficult to recognize as abuse or as domestic violence. They're often happening behind closed doors. There's no visible injuries, right? And in this white outer ring, we see things like physical and sexual violence, which we more typically associate with domestic violence. And in our work, that's often whenever we're seeing folks in the hospital is after they've experienced one of those forms of violence. And that's whenever they're getting linked with our help. But we know that domestic violence is so much more than that, as we've all been discussing so far. And on the last thing here, we see this outer light blue ring that includes things like sexism, racism, homophobia, ableism, xenophobia, and transphobia. And so these are all the societal level factors of discrimination that also domestic violence itself is rooted in the sense of inequality and the sense of maintaining power and control over certain people or maybe even groups of people based on certain qualities that they have. But it can also make it that much harder for people to escape an abusive relationship. For example, if we're thinking about factors like racism, we know that there's a history of police violence against people of color in this country. And so that might cause some folks to be like, I'm afraid to call the police about my partner abusing me because I'm afraid of what might happen to them. I'm afraid of what might happen to me if I were to do that. And like I mentioned earlier, if we're thinking about that ableism example with someone being reliant on a mobility device, that's something that's not within their control, but that partner might be able to use to their advantage to keep them from escaping that relationship. So there are, again, I repeat this all the time, but there are so many different factors and ways that this might show up. And it's up to us to be able to recognize if power and control is being used to weaponized against someone in a relationship. Do we have any questions about all of this so far? Okay. And feel free, if you have questions, drop them in the chat throughout. I'm going to try to go a little bit quickly through this because I know we got a lot of stuff to cover, and I want to make sure that we can get to all the important stuff here. But this cycle of violence just kind of helps some folks maybe to recognize what they've been experiencing, because they might feel like, they're crazy. Why do I keep continuing this on and off cycle with this person? What does it mean? And this can help to kind of provide survivors with a roadmap of what their experience might look like. And so we see that domestic violence often occurs in a circular nature. And it often starts with the honeymoon phase, which is just like any other relationship, right? Where you're just getting to know that person, you're just trying to date them. There's no arguments happening. Everything is really good and fun. Maybe you're going on lots of dates. It's very romantic. Maybe there's a lot of gift giving involved. It's just a fun time without any kind of problems. And abusive relationships can often start out this way as well, right? Because if there was abuse from the start, then no one would want to stay in that relationship. But it often starts subtly and slowly, which can make it harder to notice. And that person has already developed feelings and care and love for that person by then, which can make it that much harder to leave. And so after the honeymoon phase is when the tension building begins. That the survivor might start to feel really anxious and like they're walking on eggshells, and because their potentially abusive partner is starting to show those red flags. They're starting to get irritated or angry or have some kind of outburst, like more often than expected, and the survivor doesn't really know why it's happening. They can't make sense of it, and they just are starting to feel more and more anxious. And as things move to the explosive phase, that's whenever some form of abuse that we just talked about can occur. And then often things will move into the calm phase. And that can look like denying, deflecting blame onto the survivor, gaslighting that survivor, which is making them question their own sense of reality. And so it can look like, you're so clumsy, you probably fell or you probably bumped into a table and that's why you have those bruises, right? I didn't touch you. I don't know what you're talking about. Or, you're so dramatic. You're always making things such a big deal, right? You just need to calm down. Or it can look like apologizing and saying things like, I am so sorry. This is so unlike me. This is never going to happen again. I promise. Please just give me another chance. And we know that for survivors of domestic violence, like we said, they have that love and care for their partner. And so whenever they're hearing them making these pleas to take them back and to give them another chance, that can be really effective. But we'll see that this cycle will often continue. And that actually on average, it can take up to 7 full cycles through this cycle of violence before a survivor is able to successfully leave that relationship. And so that's why it's really important that supporting survivors regardless of where they're at in their journey is so important because leaving is a process. So I have another question for you all. If you can drop it in the chat here. Let's see. What else do you think are some barriers to leaving an abusive relationship? What might prevent someone from being able to leave? What might stop them? What are some barriers? Yeah, a lot of things that we've talked about already, right? Money, finances, children, lack of resources, not sure where to go when they leave, right? Enmeshment, that's a really interesting one. Fear, doubt, self-confidence. You all are hitting this so perfectly, right? So first off, if they don't have that support, if they've been isolated from their loved ones, where are they gonna go, right? They might not know about what resources are available to them in the community. They might not know that crisis services exist. And also, even if they do know about things like shelters, we have one domestic violence shelter in the county. Sometimes it's full, right? And there are other shelters out there, but that can be really scary. And like some of you mentioned, right, fear, like we talked about earlier, that can be the most dangerous time for survivors. So that's a whole other reason. They might have been receiving threats. If you leave, I'll take the kids. I will kill myself, right? There's so many different ways that this can show up. So it seems like you all have a really great grasp on this. And shame, right? And lack of family support, not just about where can you go whenever you're trying to leave, but also like family members saying, this is what marriage is. You should just ride this out, right? You got into this relationship. It's your job to deal with it now. But you all are really showing all of the different barriers that can pop up. So, and pets, right? Like Linda mentioned, the pets. Often shelters can't accommodate pets either. So there are so many factors to this. Incredible job, guys. Okay. So now we're going to talk about consent. I'm going to try to keep this brief as well so we have enough time for everything. But so affirmative consent is the definition that we use, which is a knowing, voluntary, and mutual decision among all participants to engage in a sexual activity. And you'll see here that consent is really key to both safe and enjoyable sex, as well as healthy relationships. And what's really going to distinguish a healthy from an unhealthy or even abusive relationship is consent at the core, right? Is there consent about how we're using our finances in our relationship, or is one person using that to control the other? Is there consent around our sexual activities, around how we treat each other and our boundaries emotionally, or is there not? And we'll see here that consent is knowing and voluntary. So if we go to the next slide, we will see that silence does not equal consent. And this is really important because some of us may have heard of the slogan like no means no, which is that we should respect if someone says no, that they do not want to have sex. We do not push them to do that. We listen to their no. We respect that boundary. However, though, we do know that there are times where someone may not be able to say no, whether they are drunk or incapacitated, they're asleep or passed out. Maybe they are having a freeze trauma response and they are not able to verbally say no in that moment. Or maybe they're just shy and they don't feel comfortable voicing that boundary. Silence is not consent. We need there to be an affirmative, a clear, a communicated yes. And so that's one really important thing to be aware of. As we talked about earlier, right, prior sexual activity does not mean that there's consent every time, regardless of the status of that relationship. And then consent cannot be given when there's coercion, intimidation, force, or threats. So that's what we mentioned earlier with, in the last slide, it has to be voluntary. And that means that there's no threats about, I'm going to break up with you if you're not ready for this sexual act, right? Or you're not having sex with me enough, I want to end this relationship, and using that as a threat to coerce that person into doing things that they do not want to do, right? We want everyone to have equal decision-making power in order to have that consent. Okay, we can keep it moving. And so we might think about sexual violence as primarily being sexual assault and rape. That's what we see on things like Law and Order SVU. It's what we see in the news often. However, just like domestic violence, there are a lot of ways that this could show up that we might not expect. With the use of a lot of different apps and technology, we see a lot of sharing nudes without consent, nude pictures, intimate photographs. And so those could be images that maybe were sent consensually during the relationship, and then after maybe an argument or a breakup, those are shared or posted without the person's consent. Or maybe someone on the internet is receiving photos or pictures that they did not even consent to receiving in the first place. Even if there's no physical contact involved, that is still falling under the umbrella of sexual violence. I also want to touch on stealthing, which is a term that not many folks are familiar with. It is referring to whenever two individuals are agreeing to have sex under the assumption that there's some form of protection being used, often a condom, and then that's at some point removed without the other person's knowledge or consent. And so that, although there was consent to have sex in the first place, it was under this knowledge that there was protection being used. And if that boundary is being broken without that person's knowledge or consent, that absolutely falls under the umbrella of sexual violence. Any questions here about this? Okay, we'll keep it moving.
What was that called?
That was called stealthing.
Stealthing. Okay.
Yes, and it's a form of reproductive coercion. So there's also other things that fall under that umbrella. If we're thinking about like one person having their birth control or other forms of protection withheld from them, or maybe one individual's lying about using some form of birth control that they're not actually using, right? It's any kind of lack of informed consent there about their reproductive ability or rights. Okay. Very quickly here, can anyone share what are some barriers that people might face or reasons why someone might not choose to report sexual violence? Right, embarrassed or feeling ashamed? Absolutely. It's a very intimate thing to be coming forward and sharing with nurses and doctors or police officers or even just like case managers. And so that can be a huge hurdle to making a report. I see fear of retribution, absolutely. Or maybe they have a prior history of experiencing a similar type of trauma. And that can really compound that and make it even more difficult to come forward. Yes, and great point, Linda, right? We can see often overlap between domestic and sexual violence. And most often, actually, the perpetrator in situations of sexual violence is someone that the victim already knew in some way. So whether that is an intimate partner, whether that is a friend, a family member, a coworker, or a classmate, right? It's often someone that the person already knew. And so that can bring up a lot of complicated decisions about, do I make a report? What might happen to that person if I choose to do that? Oh, okay, and then they may not even recognize that what they've experienced is sexual assault. Absolutely. All right, we will keep it moving now. Perfect. So really quick, just that we all have a role to play in these conversations, and victim blaming, which is essentially just making the person who's coming forward after their experience of any of these forms of violence feel like what happened is their fault. We know it's never the victim's fault for what happened because we need to be establishing that consent at all times. And so if you hear questions like, you're a man, how could they have assaulted you? Or haven't you had sex with them before? Why is it a problem now? Or, why didn't you break up with them sooner? Or did you try to fight them off? Like if you didn't fight, then how do we know that you actually didn't want to do that, right? But we know that these questions are just placing the blame on the victim instead of the perpetrator, and that this can be extremely discouraging, and another reason that survivors may be hesitant to come forward because they know that they'll be met with this kind of response. And so we all have a role to play in combating this kind of dialogue, right, and changing the script in our society about what it means to be a victim of these forms of violence. Okay, and I'm gonna skip through some of this. Like we already mentioned, right? Some people might not be able to say no and verbally in that situation, and that's because they might be experiencing a freeze trauma response. And what's important is that during any form of trauma, whether that's sexual or domestic violence, the body and the brain is just reacting in that moment. It's not a logical decision. It's your body's survival or trauma response. And that's not up to the survivor. And so we don't want to be judging a survivor's experience based on whether they tried to get away or whether they didn't fight back. Right? We know that that's just how their body was choosing to react in that moment. And that's why we just want to listen to survivors' stories and believe them. Yeah, and the same thing goes for how they respond going forward. Whenever we're in the hospital, we'll see all types of different responses that might not really make sense to folks who aren't familiar with it. Things like maybe that person is telling a story of what happened to them and they're cracking jokes the whole time, they're laughing. Or maybe they are extremely tired and they don't really have a good memory of what happened, even though it just happened a few hours ago or yesterday. And these are all just different physical responses to that trauma and coping strategies. And we don't want to judge the validity of someone's story based on that. Okay, now we are going to shift gears and talk a little bit about crisis services and the work that our advocate department does and the resources that we provide. Like I already mentioned, we provide 24-hour emergency response and crisis counseling to all survivors of these different forms of violence that you see here, to all of the Erie County emergency departments. We are the Erie County designated rape crisis center, as well as a non-residential domestic violence service provider, which just means that we don't have a shelter ourselves, but we do provide case management services to all of these folks. Yep, and so these are this is a quick overview of the medical options that are available in all Erie County emergency departments. This is evidence collection performed by trained sexual assault nurse examiners. These can, the sexual assault kit and examination can be billed to the Office of Victim Services. So that means that folks don't have to worry about their insurance covering it. If they're wanting to get that kit performed, it can be billed directly to them and they don't have to worry about that. And also folks in the state of New York, 12 and up, get to make their own decisions about all of this. So they don't need parent accompaniment. The intervention is focused on what that individual wants to happen. Yeah, and that's just something important to be aware of. So a little bit briefly about our case management. We accompany folks throughout the criminal justice process, throughout maybe they need to get an order of protection. Maybe they need to be linked to different community resources like therapy. Maybe they need help safety planning because it is so dangerous to leave an abusive relationship. We help with all of these things and more, as well as just providing supportive counseling from the perspective of folks who understand what it's like to be in that situation, and they're able to help guide them through it in a non-judgmental way. And these are all free, voluntary, and confidential services. Lastly, I'm going to drop into the chat a few things. You can see here the hotline number for crisis services, 716-834-3131, is our 24-hour hotline, which can give you access to a crisis counselor if you're experiencing mental health crisis, as well as get you connected to our advocate department case management services. I'm dropping two links right now in the chat. The first one just takes you to our link tree, which has tons of resources on everything in this topic available to you there. And the second one is actually a post presentation survey, just so we can get your feedback on how this went, what you're still curious about, what questions that you have, and what you'd like to see in the future. And then you can also see here on the screen the New York State Domestic and Sexual Violence Hotline phone number that is right there. Okay, and here is my phone number and email as well if you have additional questions for me. But we can go ahead. I know we're almost at time right now. It's almost 1 p.m. But if anyone has questions, I'm here to answer.
I know people are, you were interactive, but let me be the first to say thank you very much. I did a virtual hand clap, and this was a great presentation, a needed presentation. Many here, I'm glad you left your number. We'll make sure that we post this information up. I'm going to turn this over to Debbie Lombardo, who is the president of the Board of Block Clubs, and she also has some other members on as well. Debbie?
Yep. Hi, guys. We'll make it real quick because it's 12:59 and Oz is really good about everybody's time. Great presentation. Really, really good. Might be something that Board of Block Clubs could look into. Maybe we can do a, a full-fledged on presentation, not at a meeting, but, an additional type of thing. Right now, Board of Block Clubs in November and December is on hiatus. Everybody will be celebrating their holidays and enjoying family and friends. So there's no general meeting in the next 2 months. We'll start back up in January. If anything does come up or we're doing any type of programming, we'll make sure that Oz and Nicole and the team get the information to share. Otherwise, all is good on the Block Club front. People are kind of settling down now and kind of taking a little bit of a break. So I will keep you all informed. And that's it. We have a wonderful weekend. Go Bills and enjoy whatever it is that you're doing. The weather's not too bad out, so we have to enjoy these wonderful days as we get them. And that's it. That's it for me. And Linda's on, so we're good.
Listen, again, thank you for sharing this information. We'll be posting this up on social media and letting people know. And again, have a great weekend. Let's be safe and let's go Bills.
Bye, everybody.
Happy
Go
November.
Bills.
Bye. Thank you, Sam. It was a wonderful presentation. Really
Thanks so much,
terrific.
Linda.
And
I
timely.
appreciate it.
Very timely. I have a friend who's in dire need, so she'll be in contact. Thank you.
Great, yes, and I definitely recommend reaching out to that hotline number
Okay.
to get connected to